A glass to the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age. Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages audio journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Crosstime Pub, asking the big questions about the big mysteries of deep time. And as always, joining me here in studio are James Waldo, geologist extraordinaire, and Jason Pentrail, my brother from another mother. Jason, how you doing, bud?
Hey, doing good, man. Freshly back from a little traveling. I had to head down to Puerto Rico for a week for work. And yeah, beautiful down there as usual. Good to be back home though, but it was good to get on a plane and actually fly somewhere and get out and just break the routine a little bit of everything that we've been going through for the past couple of years. Great trip.
Yes, indeed. I've done a little travel lately myself. Spent a little time in Brazil last month, and that was also beautiful. Hope to go back sometime in the near future. Beautiful places, almost like the beautiful mind of James Waldo. How are you doing there, Waldo?
I'm doing pretty well, Micah. I haven't been doing much traveling, but I have been kind of transitioning to fall and cooler weather, which means I've stacked some firewood over the last weekend. And that beer I was telling you guys about that I put in the fermenter, turns out that was a month ago, and it's about ready to come out. My calendar reminder popped up today, and I thought, well, hot dang, it's time for Moose Drool beer. Or is that? No, it's Caribou Slobber. It's kind of a takeoff of Moose Drool for the home brewing crowd. I've made it before. It's a brown nut ale. It's really pretty dang good. So I think I'm going to keg that up this weekend and have one.
Yeah. Now, guys, he told me about the secret ingredient. Autumn leaves are put right in there into the fermenter, and they give it that nice brownish color. Yeah, I'm kidding, actually. But, I had a recent new addition, I guess, to my lineup of fall beverages. Jason, I took you a while back over to the Whistle Hop Brewery right here in my neck of the woods where I am, and they have a very interesting pumpkin marzen that is also brewed with molasses. Interesting flavor, not quite a pumpkin beer, but it has that kind of autumn flavor to it that, I always look forward to this time of the year, so it was really tasty. I enjoyed it. Jason, I don't guess you're probably having any kind of autumn brews over there, are you?
Well, just this one with the orange label on it. So it's not any pumpkin spice or anything, but it's a good, clean Oktoberfest, and it's a good one. It's nothing fancy. It's just the Samuel Adams, but it's a good one this time of the year. The Whistle Stop, is that the name of the place that we went?
Whistle Hop, although
Whistle Hop.
Yeah. But although it's actually in a caboose, it
was a really cool place. It's the first time I've ever had a beer in a train on the land overlooking a interstate. So quite the experience.
Yeah.
But yeah, very cool place. And they had some really good beer. So yeah, I'd like to go back there sometime.
Indeed. Yeah, it's absolutely wonderful. And I enjoy stopping by. Although, again, they have really grown. Their operation has grown. They've done a lot of improvements. During the pandemic, for a time, I guess people couldn't get in there. And with the anticipation that warm weather and maybe, some return to a sense of normalcy would return again, they did all these upgrades and improvements. And now it's really the happening spot. And Dustin, one of the gentlemen over there who actually mans the taps, told me that they had their busiest day ever just last week. Not surprising when you pair the wonderful beverages they have on tap with the beautiful weather we have here in the land of the sky right now. But in addition to those German-style beers, on the subject of Germany, I don't know if you guys saw recently that scientists have found a new type of ancient human who lived about 7,000 years ago. This addition to the ongoing lineup of new discoveries of this sort. These remains belong to a young female, according to an article at Study Finds. that was buried in a cave on the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, according to a recent study. That study, of course, led by a group of researchers there at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, and hence the German connection. Now, according to this Study Finds article, which admittedly is difficult to read since there are so many ads on the page, researchers say that they discovered the 7,200-year-old remains of the girl's body in Lang Paning, located in Sulawesi's southern coast. The co-author of the study, Adam Broom, quoted here, he's a professor at Griffith University in Australia, says that the genome represents a previously unknown divergent human lineage. That's what sets her apart from other known types of humans from this era. And they say that it does not appear anywhere else in the world today. Although, however, they do say that the DNA that they were able to extract from the portion of her skull does indicate traces from Denisovans, which were, of course, only discovered in recent years as well. But this is such an exciting time for anthropology because of all these new human types and divergent paths that the human family tree appears to have taken. And, of course, as more and more of these show up, I hold out hope that there are going to be some new discoveries and some even more interesting changes, I guess, in our perspectives about history and the cousins that we once shared this earth with as recently as the Pleistocene. In this case, again, 7,200 years ago, that actually was within the Holocene, and so we're talking about even more recently.
It turns out that the human species has more hats than the Pope.
Indeed. It certainly looks that way. Very interesting stuff. And of course, again, add this to all the other recent discoveries, some of which we have covered here on the program. In recent months, we've had all kinds of fascinating anthropological discoveries from all different parts of the world. So yeah, again, it seems almost like every day a new chapter is being written, or really actually being discovered. They were written long ago, weren't they?
Yeah, well before any of our times. The last 10 years has really had some really significant discoveries in this field, and it seems almost like monthly now we're getting new DNA results, we're getting new finds, we're getting new bones and species, and it's really starting to paint a much more complicated picture of the past, to say the least. I think it's fascinating. I've been reading all these articles and just constantly seeing more and more information coming to light, so it's been a great journey so far. Bringing it back to North America with recent discoveries, coming out of an article from Michigan News, which is part of the University of Michigan. The article I want to talk about today is called Farm Field Rewrites Archaeological History in Michigan. And it's basically interesting to us because we're looking at not only the professional side of archaeology, but we're looking at the avocational side as well. And those two met here at this particular site with really astounding results. So an independent researcher, along with the University of Michigan, researchers have identified a 13,000-year-old Clovis campsite right in the middle of a farm field.
Wow.
It's now thought to be the earliest archaeological site in Michigan. The site predates previously identified human settlements around the Michigan basin, and they're saying potentially is rewriting the history of peopling and settling in that whole entire Great Lakes region. So it's pretty significant. This site was occupied by a small group of people, they think about 6 or 7, who briefly lived on a river located southwest in the southwest portion of the state toward the end of the Pleistocene. So previously there was very little evidence of the Clovis in Michigan because that whole state, for the most part, except for this one little triangular shaped area, was covered at that time by the ice sheet. So this is a very kind of niche little area where people could have been, and now they've found the evidence for it. Thomas Talbot's the guy that we're talking about. He's a self-taught researcher, and he found the first Clovis point there in 2008, doing a surface field walk across the field there. He found that first Clovis indicator. He said he often walks the fields that time of the year after the fields have been plowed. And all in all, he says he found about 9 pieces from the Clovis era. That included 2 pieces of the same spear point that had been broken, and he had found them years apart. So that's really interesting. Fast forward to 2019, he met with Henry Wright from the University of Michigan. He's an anthropologist and archaeologist, to show him the collection, much like we've done here in the Southeast when we've had the opportunity to connect collectors with professionals for their collections to get documented. The same thing happened here. Wright was able to confirm Talbot's suspicions, and in the following summer, 2020, the University of Michigan researchers led by Nash began the dig at the site, now called the Belson site, which is named after the family of farmers who own the land. Soon, they said that some of the pieces are going to be going to a lab in Colorado where they're going to do protein residue analysis and hopefully be able to identify some of the animal or plant remains that are left there on the spear point. So a big day for not only Clovis research, but for the state of Michigan, and a great example of avocationalists working hand in hand with professionals.
That's fascinating. I'm always excited about Clovis discoveries, and obviously our listenership is, especially given consideration to the fact that one of our most popular episodes of all time, actually, our most popular period, was the Clovis Enigma. That episode obviously resonated with people, and I, again, still get very excited about that subject. A question, though, as more and more discoveries continue to be made that push back, the time scale on when first, arrivals into North America and eventually South America began to occur, do we extend this idea of Clovis back, or do we recognize more and more, as we have argued in the past on the program, Clovis is the technology, but the people who used it had been here for quite some time already by the time those, very specific technologies began to appear? What do you think, Jason?
Well, I think we're continuing to build the narrative, and, I think every year or two, we're going to see more and more evidence. Over the next couple of decades, we're going to continue to see the story rewritten. And like we always do here at 7Age, is just follow the data and try to make the most of what we're able to get from it. Obviously, I think with the recent discoveries throughout the country and the world, I certainly think that the case for pre-Clovis or before Clovis or earlier than Clovis, whichever term you want to use, I think it's definitely increasing that there were people here. But again, we're just tying that tradition back to that fluted projectile point technology, which is the clear calling card of this particular tradition.
Certainly. I guess these earlier arrivals and the indications of that based on the kinds of discoveries that are being made, that probably is not so surprising to a guy who spends most of his time looking at deep time, right, James Waldo?
Well, that's not super surprising. We keep finding evidence that human beings have been in North America for much longer than previously thought. There's a recent story about some human footprints that were found around White Sands, New Mexico, that turned out to be around 23,000 years old. They had, I think, footprints have been found in that area before, but they just hadn't been dated. And in this case, there was some organic material, I think some seeds in this case, that were able to be carbon dated and found to be 23,000 years old, which is really kind of pushing the limit for carbon dating. I think 25,000 or so is about the limit on that. What's interesting about these footprints is when they excavated the footprints, if you look at the article and look closely at the pictures, the footprints themselves are not depressions, they're actually in relief. So the material that the footprints were where somebody stepped in the mud, basically, were filled in with some other more resilient material, I assume sand. So when the excavation was made, they actually excavated around and left that more resilient material. But what I think the takeaway here really is how many people have to be in an area over time before they leave footprints in such a way that they get preserved. And I would say probably quite a few. There's probably quite a few people leaving footprints over a long period of time to finally get some that are captured and then to be found, at this point in the future. So that's pretty fascinating.
It is fascinating. Again, we're talking about ichnofossils here. In other words, footprints that were fossilized and then thereafter discovered. There have been a lot of those kinds of discoveries made over time, but the fossil representations that we have, both of where people have walked and of actual living specimens, people, animals, and what have you, those are far fewer than the actual biological specimens, right? And this is the important thing, I think, especially looking at deep time, as we mentioned earlier. There are probably a lot of representative species that have come and gone that we don't have in the fossil record, and I'm not so certain that we're ever going to find them. They may not have ever been fossilized. And so, given the unique conditions that are required for fossil formation, sure, fossils are a fairly common occurrence in the big picture, but there's an awful lot that hasn't been fossilized. And to find actual representations, and we can trace that back to a certain time and know that humans were there, again, like you say, James, to me that actually probably does point to the idea that there would have been a whole lot more people. If there had just been maybe, one very small group of hunter-gatherers making their way south across the continent, having emerged across the Bering Land Bridge, it seems pretty unlikely to me that one very small group would have pass through an area that met those kind of conditions. Same might also be said at sites like Monteverde, where similar footprints were recovered, not ichnofossils per se, but nonetheless, the actual representations left by the foot of an ancient human. And so, I think it's very fascinating, because what that really points to is a much more populated version of the ancient Americas than we once would have thought about. Hey, by the way, speaking of the population out there, I want to thank some of our listeners here for a moment, because a couple of them have come out in support of the 7 Ages audio journal in recent days. Brian Marshall sent along a nice donation of $100. Thank you very much, Mr. Marshall. Also, Bruce Depp, just a few days afterwards, sent along $200. That's a little money in the 7 Ages coffers. We'll tuck that away and save it for a rainy day. Who knows how much is being stored in the well that we toss our coins at the bottom of right now.
Yeah, that $200, is that our record donation? That's quite a lot of Guinness money there.
Yeah, might actually be. So, and again, thank you very much, Bruce, for sending that along. It's much appreciated. Much appreciated to all of you guys out there that support this program in the many ways that you do. Ongoing donations from our pal George Howard, Christina Frawley, and a few others also on the monthly recurring subscription level. So thanks to all you guys also. We really appreciate it. We also appreciate the people who support the program in other ways. One of them, a dear friend of the 7 Ages team, that is Chase Pipes. What's going on over there at the Smoky Mountain Relic Room, Jason?
Well, as always, Chase is out there gathering up all the very best for the shop. And of course, this is the Christmas season. We're going to get through Halloween here coming up soon. And then I'm sure, as you've noticed in the stores, everybody's attention will be turning toward Christmas. So they've got some incredible new things there in the store. Don't forget that the store has just been doubled in size. So they've got more cases. They filled them up with crystals and minerals and all sorts of exciting relics from history. They've also got some new exciting shopping options coming here soon, where you can actually shop live with an associate of the store via the internet to get those really unique Christmas gifts that you won't find anywhere else. So they're filling up the store. It's looking great. The educational branch, Chasing History, over there on YouTube, is busy churning out brand new videos from his recent trips west. So there's going to be all sorts of new things on dinosaurs and fossils and archaeology over on the YouTube channel. And then also the Chasing History Radio podcast. Got new episodes from the Denver Fossil and Mineral Show, early science and medical books, one episode on the Wilderness Road State Park, an area that we had some conversations with Chase about last time we were all together. So again, YouTube going strong, the podcast, lots of new content coming out, and the store is going to be filled for the holidays with the absolute best in history. Again, Chase is so busy out there on the road, and he's literally trying to find the very best things to build interest in history, get kids involved, and educate the public about all the types of history, going all the way back from the beginning of time, all the way up to recent. So again, the Smoky Mountain Relic Room, that's therelicroom.com, the largest diversity of history for sale in North America.
Indeed, we think the world of Chase Pipes, of course, all the work he does to educate the public, and we also appreciate him joining us occasionally on our adventures. We hope to do that again with him real soon. Also, I understand a few folks have left wonderful, favorable 5-star reviews of our program. Is that true?
Yes, absolutely. And again, these reviews are really paramount to the show growing, and everyone's really been stepping up lately, and we certainly appreciate it. So we just want to take a moment here to acknowledge those who have taken the time to leave us some reviews. So first of all, we have a ZMZ who says, "So good, the absolute best archaeology podcast. I recently discovered this podcast while looking for information on the Clovis people. Keep up the great work." Pat D. to Foxfire writes, "The best, interesting, intelligent, and insightful. I listen to many podcasts. This is one of the best." Marky Mark 2020 writes, "I'm hooked. Love the topics and the cast of experts in their respective fields interviewed." Jimothy writes, "Great and educational. Love the podcast. The guys are normal, down to earth, and very professional in their research. I would love to discuss BRMs and Chilean history, migration theories, exploring South America, and my visits to Monteverde with them. Keep them coming." And a very, very special review that I really want to send a heartfelt thanks out to Charles Reese. He's one of our listeners, and he writes, 7 Ages. He says, "I'm a student at Western Carolina, majoring in anthropology and concentrating in archaeology. Why is that? To be honest, it has a lot to do with me being inspired by 7 Ages my freshman year of college. Now I'm working in a museum and living the dreams. So, Charles, we want to thank you for everything that you've done, because you've left us feedback in the past and you've corresponded with us, and we certainly appreciate you taking the time to do so. And frankly, we are kind of just taken aback that, we made an impact like that, and we certainly, encourage you to keep it up. We need people in the field and continuing to pursue these types of programs. So, wish you all the very best, and we hope that we certainly can meet up with you sometime.
Yeah. So I've said this to you guys before, and I probably said it on the show, but when somebody sends us a note like that and says that they've, basically chosen a path for their life based on the work that we're doing here, it's super humbling to me. It really, I think that's a compliment of the highest order for us. And I really appreciate, people sending us those notes. And I mean, I don't know, it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of hard for me to verbalize, but it's really kind of I feel like a lot of times I'm just some guy, we're just kind of doing this on the side. But people are listening to the show and changing their lives. I mean, it's amazing to me.
It really is humbling. It's really appreciated. Also, we appreciate all the folks who write to us. But again, when people tell us that this show inspired them to get more involved in the academic pursuit of knowledge about our past, yeah, that means a lot. We are absolutely thrilled to hear about that. And if you guys would like to email us, of course, you can always write to anyone here on the program, James, Jason, or Micah at 7ages.org is the email. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, we always appreciate all the reviews, all the donations, and even sponsorships too. And if you'd like to do like Chase Pipes has done and others have done in the past, you can contact Jason at 7ages.org. He'll be happy to field any inquiries from potential sponsors out there. We, of course, appreciate all of the efforts that you guys provide to keep us and this podcast going. And with that in mind, it's time for us to turn our attention over to the recent research being done by a couple of colleagues of ours and friends of the program who have joined us in the past, Malcolm Lecompte and Christopher Moore. And this time they're bringing along a friend, Tim Witwer. They are all three among the group of co-authors of a new paper that looks at what happened at Tall el Hammam many, many thousands of years ago. This is quite a story, and yet, of course, it also has direct relationship to the ongoing questions we have about Earth changes that occurred long ago, which we have explored in the past on this program. We're going to dig into this conversation with Malcolm, Chris, and Tim when we return right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. Welcome back. We have quite a roundtable discussion tonight, and it is a timely one because not only are we joined by several of our very favorite researchers and friends of the program, but also co-authors of a recent study that shed some rather unsettling light on an ancient mystery. We'll get right into the introductions. Christopher Moore is a return guest to the program, a geoarchaeologist by trade. Chris received a B.S. in anthropology from Appalachian State University in 1997, an M.A. in anthropology from East Carolina University in 2000, and a Ph.D. in coastal resources management with a focus in geoscience from East Carolina University in 2009. Chris's research interests include geoarchaeology, luminescence dating, and of course his work as a member of the Comet Research Group. Chris, my brother, how are you, sir?
Doing good, thank you.
Indeed, good to have you here, and of course, joining Chris tonight is Malcolm Lecompte, who is also returning to the program, maybe his third or fourth installment now. Dr. Lecompte received his Ph.D. in astrophysical, planetary, and atmospheric sciences from the University of Colorado in 1984, and he did postdoctoral research at Harvard College Observatory. He also managed and did research and development work for the Department of Defense, sponsored programs involving remote sensing technologies. He, too, of course, is examining the comet question in relation to ancient mysteries, and he joins us tonight. Malcolm, my friend, how are you?
I'm good.
Great to have you here. You know, we are seeing more and more of you these days. And lastly, we are also joined tonight by Tim Witwer, a member of the Comet Research Group with an A.B. in biology and a B.S. in chemistry. He attended Wittenberg University in Springfield, Ohio, and Boston University thereafter. With a background in the ER, he served as chief and director at the Quincy City Hospital Emergency Department for 2 years and has been in private practice in Elizabeth City, North Carolina for more than 3 decades. Tonight, he joins us to discuss the co-authored paper that these 3 gentlemen have worked on regarding this enigmatic site, Tall el Hammam. Tim, welcome to the program. Your first time.
Thank you.
Indeed. Great to have all of you here, and we have much to discuss.
The paper that we're going to be looking at tonight has been making its rounds. I'm sure you've seen it all over social media. It was published at nature.com under the title, "A Tunguska-sized airburst destroyed Tall el Hammam, a middle Bronze Age city in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea." An exhaustive paper packed with details, packed with data, and something that has really made an impact in the comet research community. So starting off the conversation tonight, Chris, I want to begin with you because I want to talk a little bit about the statistics of this paper. It really has gone viral in every sense of the word. What are some of the statistics as far as the readership of the paper to this point?
It's really quite extraordinary. On Nature Scientific Reports, it's been downloaded. I just looked a few minutes ago, I think around 307,000 times. And I think it's currently occupies a rank of 579 out of nearly 20 million papers published worldwide over the last 10 years.
Wow, that is absolutely incredible. It truly is. I mean, that really speaks to the interest in this subject, but also I think it speaks to the amount of effort that was put in. Again, this is an exhaustive paper. It truly fills in every gap in the questions that I had as you're reading through it. It truly is a remarkable piece of work. Along those lines, what about the media coverage of it? Again, this is something not just in print or not just in the Nature journal, but also all over the media. Malcolm, could you speak to that side a little bit? Because I know you've been involved with some of the media side of things.
Yeah, I can do that. I've been involved and there are others have been involved in a variety of interviews, mainly overseas, I would say. We've had a couple of Mexican inquiries, and I believe one of our co-authors is handling those. PBS, not the NewsHour, but the NPR. NPR did an interview with Jim Kennett. I've done one with the Australians, the Canadians, the Russians, and got one that may be a domestic interview tomorrow scheduled. So
very good.
It's gotten a fair amount of.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, I think it's something that has a wide appeal. It's something that's been researched heavily here at 7 Ages. But getting into the location itself, what is the paper based on? This area of Tall el Hammam. Let's begin there, Malcolm. So describe the city, its location, the size, and the associated time period.
Well, the time period is 3,600 years ago, right around there, plus or minus 50 years. The location is in the Jordan Valley, south of of Amman, southwest of Amman, and about 15 kilometers northeast of the Dead Sea, almost due north of the Dead Sea, on a rise of land that's, people who look at the overview, looking down at the terrain, liken it to the Starship Enterprise. It has kind of a central upside down Starship Enterprise, because there's a central highland that's kind of cylindrical shaped or like a drumlin, like a hill, and then lower down there's a large kind of a planaria look. If you remember the old high school biology class, with a wide spade-like foreground, that's the main city proper. The upper The hill is what we call the Acropolis or Upper Tall, and Tall in Arabic is the same as the Hebrew Tel, which means hill, or a collection of ruins that have been piled atop one another to create an artificial hill. So you hear about these archaeological sites called tells, and that's what this is, a tall with an upper and lower portions. And then surrounding it is a plain that is now used for agriculture, was probably used for agriculture then as well watered. I should have mentioned that the size of this city is quite large. It's one of the, if not the largest Middle Bronze Age urban center at the time, one of the largest, certainly. I'd say it's about roughly the equivalent to the size of Troy, which is, I think, about 70 acres, if I remember correctly. So it's a good-sized urban center. I'm probably hosting tens of thousands of people in population, maybe up to 50,000. So a lot of people occupying this site in the agricultural portions, the city proper, and the palace, the Acropolis. There were springs on and perennial rivers on both sides of the north and south side that came down and fed into the Jordan River. So it was bordered by water. There were springs that were providing the interior with water, and both hot and cold springs. So it was a very advantageous spot to have a city. And it may have been older than Jericho, or at least contemporary to it.
Now, of course, with a blast that by some estimates was around 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima atomic bomb, if it were a large urban center, of course, there would have been incredible destruction and loss of life. Can we discuss the state in which this city appeared in the excavations and what it tells us about the event that occurred?
Picture, and we have a picture in the paper, I believe, or the city was surrounded by an immense wall with gigantic towers at different points. At the southwestern end, there was a very large tower. There were two very large towers on each side of the main gate, which was on the southern side of this great wall that surrounded the city. And the upper tell also had very, very steep ramparts that were topped by a wall that encompassed the Acropolis or palace area, and only the upper stories, 4 or 5 stories, were above that wall. So you could just see the highest buildings, the highest palace structures, peeking out over the edge of that wall. Tim has been with me all 3 times that I was there, so I'm seeing if he has any memory of anything I've missed in this.
Certainly.
No, we can probably, as we go along.
Yeah, so that's basically the basic description of the city.
The site goes all the way back to around the Chalcolithic period. We're looking at around 4300 BCE. This extends up through the early Bronze Age, the Intermediate and Middle Bronze Ages, Iron Hill, Hellenistic, Roman, and other more recent periods. There also, if my understanding is correct, were periods where there was abandonment of the site as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, they actually believe it was originally populated in the Neolithic.
Wow.
And grew in the Chalcolithic and the early and Middle Bronze Age into the they call it the Intermediate Bronze Age, which is sort of before between the early and the middle. There's the Intermediate Bronze Age, and up to the Middle Bronze Age, 1600 BC, was I would say the maximum extent of the city. And after that, there really was no replacement of that city. It was occupied by smaller structures, smaller habitation, perhaps a traffic or trade station, possibly a guardhouse or a watchtower or something to that effect, but nothing extensive, not like the original city. So had a long and complex history. But during the period from 1650 at its destruction through about, make it about 1000 BC, the site, the valley, was pretty well abandoned. And the cause of that abandonment is not actually very clear. There was, before that, the end of that abandonment, when it became agriculturally viable again, there was apparently a weighing station or trade station where you'd pay taxes on caravans going through carrying trade goods, and the evidence looks like they had storehouses, and that was sort of I believe the late Bronze, early Iron Age, right around maybe 1200 BC to about 1000 BC, but still no major occupation at that time.
I see.
Later on, Romans came in, the indigenous population reoccupied, and agriculture began again.
So the site has an obviously long and complex history, as many of the sites in that area do. As we begin to get into the details that are coming forth from the research and the data, as well as the excavations, as far as the excavations are concerned, how long have they been going on at that site, and who are they led by? What team is doing the investigation?
It's a team that is a composite, I believe, of the Trinity Southwest University and Veritas University. I think that the Trinity Southwest is now under the umbrella of Veritas, but I'm not exactly sure of the connection between the two. Our chief archaeologist is Steve Collins, and he's led the team for approximately 15 years, as I recollect.
That's about right.
And they've been working this site different spots on the ground. Sometimes on the lower Tell, they've gotten two extensive excavations on the lower Tall. One they call the temple area or administrative area, and the other being the main gate area, which has turned out to be fairly peculiar for the time and place. Then, of course, there's the major excavation being done now in the last few seasons on the upper Tall to investigate the palace area. That has produced some interesting results as well.
Throughout the multiple excavations and the sort of the life of the project, at what point did the team start to get the sense that something maybe unusual had transpired here?
Well, apparently fairly early. They found a rock out in it wasn't at the site itself, but it was toward the Dead Sea, at a site toward the Dead Sea where they had found some pottery that had been melted. They found a rock that had really been dramatically melted. I'm trying to think. There may not be a picture of that rock, which the provenance of it was difficult to establish, but it looked like something that would have been produced by extreme temperatures that would have melted the rock into 3 phases of melt. At the site itself, they began to find pottery that were showing melt on one side. They come upon a layer in the Middle Bronze Age that was about 1.5 meters thick of debris and burned ash, broken material, burned wood, burned timbers. This 1.5 meter layer thick of ash and burned material, these pottery, melted pottery artifacts that were peculiarly melted in some cases, melted mud bricks. When I say peculiarly melted, I mean one side was melted, the other side was untouched, which is an odd thing to find. If you've got a raging fire, that's all you've got, such as you'd result from burning of a city in war or an earthquake. Moreover, they found that the destruction of the city appeared to have a direction. It appeared like that something had brought the debris and deposited it to the northeast. That most of the debris they found was oriented toward the northeast. My first trip there, at the end of my first trip, they called me to the top of the ruin to witness an 800-pound plus saddle quern. A saddle quern is a large stone that you sit upon and grind grain. This 800-pound stone had rolled off its foundation in a manner that gave you the impression it had rolled off from the southwest to the northeast. So the saddle was now facing the northeast, where it had been originally vertical. To roll an 800-pound elongate boulder, essentially, but shaped into basically a saddle and a grinding area onto its side, as it appeared, was one of the major instances where you had something that was clearly directional in nature and comported with what they had seen in terms of the broken pottery and other debris. that was sort of the clue that something was up here, and they referred to a local geologist in New Mexico who happened to have contact with one of our team. The Comet Research Group had been working with us. He said, we'd like to work on this. And the result was we sent teams 4 different times, possibly a 5th coming up here, to the site to collect samples, which is what we did.
Probably worth mentioning with regard to the pottery that was essentially glazed on one side and untouched on the other, that the process of ceramic making had not yet been developed. And so there was no way that this was artificially made.
In terms of this, this material that was obviously heated, superheated. And we've got a note here about limestone that's, burned to almost like a chalky consistency. What kind of temperatures are we talking about that would produce those kinds of results?
Fairly high. If I remember correctly, the limestone is about 1400 C, which can be reached from either warfare or an earthquake. Kind of on the high side, possibly in extreme circumstances, you might reach that, but it's still unusual. That wasn't the only evidence, of course, of high temperatures that we found, but that's a pretty significant find to have the limestone turned. It was even more interesting was what Chris had uncovered looking at the plasters, the limestone plaster, which had revealed itself when he was investigating samples.
Yeah, Chris, could you speak to that point briefly as well?
Sure. Yeah. Malcolm sent samples from the destruction layer for me to process and to examine under the microscope. And I think probably my major contribution, which I came into this whole thing very late, but was the discovery of these calcium carbonate spirals, which had not been seen before, I don't think. And really, in looking at samples throughout both above and below the major destruction layer, the very clear and very large peak in calcium carbonate spirals occurs only in the destruction layer, the burn layer. And, those are formed possibly from calcium carbonate, plaster applied in the interior portions of the ruins in the palace area. And so these spirals were formed in extreme temperatures. Malcolm, you may be able to correct me on this, but upwards of 1,500 to 2,000 degrees Celsius is probably required to create these things.
Yeah, that's the ballpark. And among other these proxies that exhibit high temperature melts, they were among the higher end of that were just not producible in these natural occurrences that were not what we ultimately assigned the destruction of the city to, which was, of course, the asteroid impact.
I want to build on what you just said. You talked about the calcium carbonate spherules, but there was also melted quartz and embedded melted iron spherules.
That's
Can
right.
you talk about that side of it a little bit? Because we're starting to see these proxies.
Right. I mean, that was Malcolm had found impact spirals in earlier samples, but when I was looking and trying to quantify the calcium carbonate spirals, I think this is probably the only one that I found, but it was a piece of melted quartz that was embedded with possibly dozens of iron dendritic spirals. Many of them deformed. Some of them were splattered onto the side of the melted quartz grain. It's certainly something that I've never seen before. And Malcolm, I think you may be able to speak to this. I'm not sure that have you ever seen anything like that with so many spirals embedded in melt lines?
No, I have seen, but never able to determine. I've seen quartz that looked like they might have had spherules embedded in it, but I never seen one where you could actually see the spherules melting into basically the quartz was so hot it was essentially a liquid, and these iron spherules were dropping into the quartz as if it was kind of a rain down onto the quartz bubble. Or quartz, what would you call it, a glob or a glob of quartz. So,
yeah, I mean, visually, it's quite stunning, and it's certainly when I saw it optically, I couldn't tell that they were dendritic. I didn't know for sure that they were made of iron until we looked under the SEM. But this was a quite extraordinary grain that was just absolutely plastered with iron spirals on top of spirals, with the classic dendritic crystalline texture that we can see under the SEM. That is, the classic signature of an impact spiral.
I would just briefly interject because I know a lot of people want to get in right now. Chris, of course, being a geoarchaeologist, you have worked a lot with quartz in an archaeological context. From time to time, we also see artifacts that have been treated by being placed in a fire or have been subjected to heat and flames. Now, you wrote in an article featured at The Conversation recently that, of course, you and the team had considered whether the site in question had been burned or destroyed through military action around 1650 BCE rather than by cosmic impact. But for military action or fire to have caused that effect, I mean, that would truly be anomalous. What you're saying is there was such intense heat that would cause the embedding of these particles in an actual piece of stone, that this is not the likes of which you are used to seeing in archaeology. Am I correct?
That's right. Absolutely. I mean, this is, and Malcolm can certainly speak more to this, but I mean, the formation of these sort of iron dendritic spirals of melted quartz certainly implies something that happened possibly within the plume, within the airburst. This is not something that's probably going to or necessarily going to happen from immediately where the grain was found, and certainly nothing that I've ever seen at any other archaeological site. Certainly the YDB sites have iron spirals, but I've never seen a melted quartz grain that was embedded with some spirals like this.
Jason?
Yeah. And according to the paper, along those same lines, there were 38 elements, minerals, and other minerals that were collectively analyzed for equilibrium melting points in that destruction layer. So with 38 different materials, again, you kind of just said it, but whether it's YD or any other type of melting ability, whether it's warfare or whatever it is there anything else, as we begin to rule out things and get down to the heart of the matter here, is there anything else that could create that degree of melting in that many different materials other than a impact or airburst?
Well, lightning can do it on a limited basis. And we were able to eliminate that possibility by taking some of the samples and submitting them to one of our colleagues, Gunther Klečka, from the Czech Republic. He was able to test them for remnant magnetism, which would be expected if it was hit by lightning. Apparently, there was no such evidence that they had been, and in addition to that, the high temperature proxies, the artifacts or grains that we found that were subject, that were melted and had to be melted at very high temperatures, were so well distributed across the site that it could not have been a localized event. This had to have been something that was area intensive. It had to hit the whole area, the whole city, in effect. And you can imagine that an asteroid coming in and having an airburst at altitude above the city, offset to the southwest probably, and that the first thing you'd get, it was the light flash that would be so close. Imagine the sun sitting there within a few kilometers of you. Basically, it would flash burn flash melt the pottery that was exposed, the mud bricks that were exposed, and ignite anything that it could. You're talking about temperatures at the source of about 5,000 degrees, and while it's not as big as the sun, it's every bit as hot. So that's the first heat wave you get. Then you've got the destruction once the plume of the object, if you will, impacts the Earth. It's going to excavate and send a column or a plume of material, superheated material at nearly supersonic speeds up the valley toward that city. And that would be a secondary heat wave that would envelop things and probably caused some sort of melting and encapsulation in this plume that would also provide enough heat for a conflagration. So you've got multiple mechanisms operating here that are going to turn the city into a fireball, basically. And then you've got the shock wave that essentially clears the foundations off the lower tell and most of what was ever exposed on the upper tell.
I think one of the things that has been learned from the Tunguska blast is that some of the trees that were left standing, the interpretation is they were the ones that were standing in the blast area were directly below where the airburst took place, which that does not sound like that was probably the case here with this, but it was very close probably to the, the epicenter of the blast, based on the, obviously thousands of atmospheres of pressure that would be, generated and of intense heat. It would be very, very close. And I think you mentioned, and I think it's in the paper as well. Actually, I know it is, but the proposed location or the suspected location of the actual airburst itself was a few kilometers south and maybe over the Red Sea, or the Dead Sea. Sorry.
Right. Red Sea would be a long way.
That's a long way. Yeah.
But in the right direction. But there's a lot of uncertainty in that. First off, we're using an impact calculator that was online. It was created by a group of impact investigators that created this mathematical model, and it was a good estimate for a generic impact where you define the parameters, but most of the variables in that model are unknown. We really, except for the temperatures that were created in the blast, that's about all we have that we can really hang a hat on in the directionality of the debris. And based upon that alone, we just do an estimate, seeing that the valley was. The other thing I should mention is that there were other population centers in the valley. We have Jericho on the other side of the valley. That's about 20 or 25 kilometers away, as I recall.
Yeah. Then
you've got Tel Nimrine, which is to the north about 10, 15 kilometers.
Yeah.
Then you've got Tel Kafrine, which is about 2 or 3 kilometers.
Close.
All of those appear to have the same basic destructive profile, basically burned at that time. So you've got a destruction area that looks like it mimics the same general area of fire that the Tunguska blast created, maybe a little more. So this thing was maybe a little stronger, maybe a little. But then if you had something coming at a steeper angle, it might have been smaller. It's just really hard to say. But it looked like it was offset to the southwest and toward the Dead Sea. Whether it was over the Dead Sea or not, we just don't know.
If we may, could we go back in terms of some of the other elements and the temperatures that were the temperature signatures, I guess, that we were actually seeing there? What other kinds of elements were found there at the site indicative of these extreme temperatures?
Well, there were some really interesting things in the melted the pottery that was melted on one side. If you look closely at that with an electron microscope, what you find are grains of quartz and zircon crystals that are melting, and you can see them melting into the matrix. In fact, the surface of the vessel, the sherd, the pottery sherd, is so liquefied that these things are moving through it. These grains and these crystals are moving through it as they melt, and they melt into the matrix. I mean, it's really remarkable to see it so clearly. You can actually trace the movement of this thing across the surface of the pottery. So there's a combination of dynamic as well as temperature, and these are temperatures of the order of 1700 C and upward to almost 2000 C. So this is not something you see in an earthquake or warfare at all. In addition, you've got spherules that have rare earth, cerium and lanthanum, that are splattered over them. That gets you into the 2000s. So now you're talking in excess of 2000 degrees. And in fact, the highest temperatures we can point to in terms of minerals are up around 2500 C.
Right. And again, there's been some discussion about during the Middle Bronze Age, they were smelting. But the temperatures they were capable of, and I think Malcolm can speak to this, were certainly far below what would be necessary to melt many of the high temperature minerals that has been found splattered on pottery and mud brick.
Right. Yeah, we find iridium iridium splatter on some of these pottery sherds, and iridium melts at 2,466 degrees, and we've got these blebs or blobs of very small. They're very small fragments. So the question is this something that is in the environment, or is it something that comes from the impactor? Iridium being, of course, a classic extraterrestrial mineral.
Yeah, that's an important point, Malcolm, I'd like to touch on with you for a moment. Again, we have speckled with tiny metallic grains of iridium, melting point around 4,435 degrees Fahrenheit, platinum at around 3,215 degrees Fahrenheit, zirconium, silicate at 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, what we are talking about are materials that are relatively rare on Earth, but that we are finding in enough abundance at this site, and all with their own unique melting temperatures, having been obviously affected by this extreme heat, which points not only to a localized source of this blast occurring, and a very hot one, but also these elements possibly coming from elsewhere. Am I correct?
That is correct. But we have to consider an alternative, which is, in the Bronze Age, one of the measures of wealth is the amount of gold you can collect, and these elements tend to collect in veins of gold. You'll find these other trace elements in existence as well. So if the treasury was hit, or if there was gold inlay on statues, or gold flecks in the paint to make it more embellish the walls of the palace, all these things could be sources of some of these materials. So what we're looking at doesn't have to be extraterrestrial. It could be local, in the environment. Meaning in the palace itself.
I see.
The lower city, simply money in the case of the temple. And we have samples from all those sites, by the way. We've collected samples from all those.
Right. Chris mentioned earlier the online impact calculator, though. This you guys use to help determine what the actual cause might have been. I want to come back to that. Tell folks at home who may not be familiar with that what exactly this is and what it does.
Well, it's a calculator that you find online. Collins and Melosh, they had created this calculator that uses the incidence angle, the size of the impactor, the velocity of the impactor, the density of the impactor, all those variables to define what the effects would be, what the speed of the shock wave, the blast, effectively, what the effects would be as far as temperature, ignition points, distance, the altitude of the air blast that, if it came in at a particular area, where would the airburst occur, what altitude, and with all those assumed, because there's a wide range, the effectively grazing incidence, which is somewhere, 5 or 10 degrees, or perhaps just a little more, up to 90 degrees. It can come straight down on top of the target, if you will, which is what it didn't do in this case. But the idea is that the more atmosphere you go through, the hotter it gets, but it also bursts at a higher altitude. The denser the material, if it's an iron bolide or an iron asteroid, it's going to survive longer and possibly, given a sufficient size, make a crater. So there's all these factors taken into account. If you have an object that reaches a certain size, it will make a crater, and they tell you the results of the calculation provide the size of the crater. So all these variable estimates that you make, so you have a wide range of possibilities, and we took what we thought was the most probable one. So we really don't know. I mean, that's the bottom line, is we just don't know. The impact calculator helped us to kind of get a ballpark idea of what may have happened. Likening it to the Tunguska event seemed to be consistent with what we were seeing. So to that extent, it was a big help. Right. But it doesn't say that we've solved the problem by any stretch.
A critic might say, well, you guys used an impact calculator to try and determine these variables, which seems to show that you already may think it's an impact. But then again, you can't deny that a lot of the criteria here do seem to point in that direction. I want to ask you really quickly, before we toss it back to James here, about something that was observed in all samples investigated, if I understand correctly, and that had to do with diamondoids. a little different from these nanodiamonds that are described in previous work by you guys and other authors with the Combat Research Group. Can you describe a diamondoid and how it is distinct from other diamond-like formations that you have found at sites like this?
I got to admit that I didn't do any of that work. I'm not familiar with it.
Do we have a diamondoid expert in the house?
Chris, can you speak to it?
The idea is that, and we're probably going to get around eventually to talking about, shock quartz and things like that. But this is organic material, plants, I'm assuming, local vegetation that under extreme pressure and heat, presumably, were converted to not nanodiamonds per se, or, but something, approximating that. And I'm certainly no expert on either one of those categories, but that's my understanding.
Certainly. In other words, we're talking about diamond-like structures, very minuscule, which, again, perhaps not true diamonds, but which are very small and which have similar structural or behavioral characteristics. Not that diamonds behave in any particular way, but again, in terms of how they might react to heat, that's what we're talking about, a similarity there. Briefly also, you mentioned shock quartz, and Jason, before we turn it back over to you, can you touch on that one as well while we're covering materials?
Malcolm, you want to speak about the shock quartz evidence?
Sure. We got some grains, some quartz grains, and had them sectioned or thin sectioned so that we have a very, we're looking through a very thin layer of this quartz, and you can see the fissures that are created by the shock wave that came through, and the level of shock that we see that would be produce what we're seeing in the quartz grains are consistent with the same suggestion of an impact of large kiloton or multi-megaton yield. We've checked it against the Trinity site and a nuclear detonation site in Russia, and it produces the same general sort of compression. And these are hundreds of thousands of higher pressure than our atmospheric pressure. So you've got a shock wave coming through the atmosphere. Well, first off, there isn't much atmosphere. The shock wave pretty much removes it, puts it into a near vacuum, which is some of the things that produce the minerals that we saw. But the shock wave comes through and it compresses the quartz, which is a very hard material to begin with, and creates fissures in the quartz. And the higher the pressure, the more fissures in different directions it creates. So we can detect those with the scanning electron microscope, the cathodoluminescent, because some of these features luminesce under certain conditions, whereas if they're created by earthquake, they do not. So
there's the amorphous quartz that we see, right?
Right. Which is the result of the temperature wave coming through. The temperature comes through; it can tend to melt the quartz preferentially along these fissures, and the end result is that you actually see the result of the amorphous quartz, the crystal or the quartz turning into an amorphous form from the temperature alongside the pressure produced fissure or crack, if you will. We call them lamellae, or lines of pressure wave coming through and cracking the quartz. These lamellae, there'll be multiple and parallel in one orientation, and then they'll be across a different orientation will have the same basic effect. And these things luminesce under the right circumstances, and we can show that the quartz is there. One thing that I'd like to talk about is something that is really at Abu Huraira, which is in northern Syria, near the Turkish border. At Abu Huraira site, we saw in some of the mud thatched, we saw evidence of the material that was used to build the mud, which was straw or reeds, and they were flash burned so quickly and so in such heat that the silicon in the reeds that gave it strength actually became impregnated in the mud itself. So you could actually see the remnants of the reeds in the mud. This mud melt. Yeah.
That is just incredible. And by the way, I'll just reference our past episode that we did on Abu Huraira for those listeners who might want further clarification about that site and what Malcolm's describing. Go on, Malcolm.
Well, you can see these things in these holes that are empty because the original reed is gone. And this was from roofing material that we examined at the site. It had been burned, but also these, I guess you'd call them almost grave sites of the original reed and vegetation material, straw that was used to reinforce the roof, the mud that created the roof. So you had this evidence of extreme temperature and burning away of these strengthening materials. We found them at both places. We found these artifacts, and you can see them in the paper where you can actually see the residual silicon embedded in the original place the reed was emplaced.
Truly incredible. So one question I have, and Chris, maybe you might want to speak on this as an archaeologist as well. As we're looking at this immense amount of data and everything based in the scientific approach, from the archaeological perspective, what do the archaeologists on site make of the materials that you're pulling from the destruction layer, and how does the archaeology work as far as sorting through a layer that thick and condensed when they're doing the archaeological side of the investigation?
I mean, Malcolm, do you want to speak to that? I mean, you know, Malcolm was actually made several trips to the site during the excavations through the destruction layer. I mean, this is pretty much like I said, a meter and a half, thick destruction deposit where everything is pretty much, jumbled together in one sort of massive deposit. It's filled the rooms. The orientation, I think, is a pretty key clue to what happened. But I think Malcolm may be able to speak more to that than I can.
There was one thing that I found remarkable, and I didn't really understand what they were telling me, the archaeologists were telling me, until much later. It had to be explained to me a number of times. It was not immediately transparent. The debris was stacked in this destruction layer. In other words, imagine a room filled with material from all the stuff that had been blown over. The walls, the furniture, everything was, the pottery, everything that was in that room was essentially destroyed and then blown against the opposite wall. So the room was filled with material. And in that material, you'd find all these fragments of things, whether it was seeds, pottery, furniture. I mean, whatever was there that wasn't totally burned into ash, whatever it was suspended in that layer. Now imagine taking away all the debris, leaving the artifacts. What you'd see is essentially in stasis the moment of destruction, the moment that this wave came through and just brought everything airborne and blew it against the side of the far wall. Now, that all that includes everything you just took away, but the idea is you can see things airborne. Imagine being in that room on the opposite side of it and getting hit with all that material. It would do some damage.
So let's pick it up because we've talked about the destruction. We've talked about the idea of what we think happened, but that's a very important part of what we're going to get into, especially with the portion of the discussion coming up with Tim. What would that look like from the ground view for someone who was at the site at that time?
Well, let's take a couple of different vantage points. Let's put a witness up in the highlands, put a witness at the city itself, say a guard standing on a parapet at the palace, and maybe somebody over in Tel el Hammam, 15 kilometers away, looking over at the city, having just kind of noticed a blast. Because Tel el Hammam is beyond a rise of land, so it wouldn't have been immediately evident what was happening in the southern part of the valley. So from the parapet where the guard is standing, first thing he'd notice is there appeared to be something coming in. He'd probably hear something and turn and look, which is what was done at Chelyabinsk in 2013. People looked up and saw this thing, and then it burst. And those people who were closest got sunburns. Well, this is much worse. So what would happen is probably the man would have been blind. He would have immediately lost his eyesight. The next thing would have happened would have been the incredible heat, surface of the sun-like heat that would have roasted him. Just standing there, he had been roasted. And then the next thing that would have happened would be the shock wave. So that would have disarticulated him. Basically, he would have disintegrated in that blast. Somebody from Tel el Hammam might have might have felt the heat wave, might have gotten the sunburn, but if this thing was at sufficient altitude to be above the rise that blocked the two cities, that intervened between the two cities. So he might have felt the heat, not realizing what was to come would have been igniting things in his town. Someone on the top of the highlands surrounding the valley might have had been witness to this thing coming in. Hopefully wasn't looking directly at it, because he might have been blind, but I suspect it would have been something that would have at least caused sunburns. I suspect that the sound would have been immense, that the sound would have been absolutely staggering to just hear this thing come in. I mean, once again, the videotapes that were produced at Chelyabinsk give you kind of an indication in a much smaller scale about what one of these things would look like.
That, in addition to the historical record, the actual remembrances of what happened at Tunguska in 1908. By some estimates, the noise and also the effects of the blast in the form of the eerie green haze that was seen in the sky could be seen as far away as other parts of Eastern Europe. And so this no doubt would have had an effect that was fairly widespread. It does warrant mention, although we haven't touched on this and we don't really want to dwell on it, but some have made the argument that the site in question here might also be a ringer for the biblical city of Sodom. Again, in Chris's article from the Conversation, he'd actually noted that 14 miles to the west of Tall el Hammam, here we had the winds from the blast hitting Jericho, and that famous traditional narrative about the walls come tumbling down. It does seem that perhaps some historic events are being described in what many recognize as a biblical narrative here.
It's difficult to get into this because we don't know these dates.
Sure.
We know that all we can say is the date that Tall el Hammam was destroyed. And we don't even know whether there's any connection to a biblical narrative of that ruin.
Right.
We know that at a given date, the city was destroyed and appears to have been destroyed by an airburst. That's about what we know. Everything else is speculation. The time frame, the scriptural time frame, if you will, between the Jericho walls and the destruction of Sodom is it's centuries. And I guess in some cases it may be described as eons. I don't know whether it's hundreds to thousands of years difference between those two events. I think that's extremely heavily debated.
Certainly.
So there's that. Beyond the fact that we have these events that, once again, given the time between when the Bible actually became literature, when it was actually written, versus the time that this destruction occurred, did some kind of narrative arise that they made up a name for a city, that there was a city? It's impossible to say. This may have been the source of the narrative that has come down in Genesis as the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. But as far as that goes, just don't know.
Right. We probably do not have enough data points. Yeah, we don't have enough data points to make any kind of conclusive determination. We also don't raise that here in this conversation, any of us, I think, with any kind of an agenda. But what we must recognize is that just like any historical narrative or, again, traditional narrative, which may contain elements of history, that makes this unique because we may have a bit of an anchor in narrative, unlike other potential airburst events or impact events, which the Comet Research Group has been studying for years, that go so far back that we don't have any kind of a historical record that may support it.
Speaking of things that we think we do know about this site, I think there were some sampling sites and some radiocarbon dating done from 4 sites there. Does anybody want to talk about that? Well,
I went out and took samples from a site in a wadi that was about a kilometer distant from the upper Acropolis or the upper Tall. So we got datable material from that. We got pottery from that, which allowed some dating to be done, stratigraphic dating. We got datable material for carbon-14 dating from all 3 sites in the city: the palace, the temple, and the main gate. The ring road is actually near the main gate, so you can kind of lump those together, if you will. So they all have effectively the destruction layer at each of those three points in the city produced the same date effectively. And if you notice in the city, there were many. I forget the number of tests that were done, but there were many of seeds from urns or broken pottery that had been part of the debris field were able to be dated. There were charred wood that was able to be dated. Of course, there may be a late carbon old wood. So there's that, but there's enough dating done to nail down the time of this event fairly securely.
Yeah, and as we continue the conversation, to this point we've talked about the city, we've talked about the potential for an impact, and we've talked a lot about the data. But essentially at the heart of the conversation, there's a human story. And I think that's really important to capture, because while the data proves the possibility of what happened, ultimately it's the human story that I think resonates with all of us the most. And I want to turn the conversation over to Tim at this point, because amongst all of the debris and the destruction layers and mixed in with those proxies, there are human remains at the site that are very indicative of what happened there, and they really tell a story. So Tim, before we get into that evidence that you focused on for your portion of the paper, please give the audience a little bit of your history in the medical profession and why it was so important for you to take part in this research.
I directed a level 3 trauma hospital in which I directed the emergency department. And we were right next to the main road that leads from Boston to the Cape. And it was a 6-lane highway even then. And so it was an unfortunately very rich source of trauma. And in the days before seatbelts and airbags, the trauma was far worse. And so I was sort of tasked to figure out what could have happened. And I dealt with a lot of broken bones and trauma, especially where people had their legs pinned under the dashboard and the rest of the windshield, or they were dismembered by going through the windshield out of the car. Terrible, terrible trauma that we don't see as much anymore. This was, I'll date myself, this was back in the 70s and early 80s. And so what happened to these folks? My understanding, and most of the actual research that I could find online, is that with an impact, the original research was done with mortars and howitzers and the shells during World War II. And what happened to GIs who were directly impacted or impacted indirectly? A lot more information came along after we started to videotape what happens in nuclear blasts, where you've all seen the pictures of suddenly everything is engulfed in a flaming wave of unbelievable winds. And the winds are obviously enough to send all of the debris up into the stratosphere that we see with nuclear blasts. It's my understanding that with impacts like this, you get a blast wave and then the blast wind. The blast wave is an intense, highly energetic compaction and then sudden rarefaction of air initially, but this goes right through tissues as well. Well, the body is 95% water, and we all know that that's uncompressible, and so it shouldn't make any difference, but it does. As a blast wave travels through tissues, goes through different tissues at different rates. And at the place where there are interfaces, it wreaks absolute havoc. And so a blast wave of any proportion, especially the proportions we might be talking about, would cause tremendous damage. Whatever, and at a farther distance, of course, this all depends on proximity. But at a greater distance, the same wave would probably knock people over. It would result in trauma where things in the body would be rapidly accelerated and then decelerated, and this results, especially in the brain, with coup and contra coup injuries to the brain, where the brain is suddenly strikes one side of the cranium, and then suddenly the brain just sits there in all of its liquid and falls back against the other side. So it would have resulted in a loss of consciousness very quickly, and then all of the other major organ damage to follow. The blast wind, on the other hand, as I understand it, follows usually, and this is on the order of many hundreds of miles per hour. Again, depending on proximity, because it falls off exponentially as you get away from the site. The only research that we have on this is from tornadoes. Tornadic winds are the only winds that we run into with any frequency that are hundreds of miles an hour. They do not dismember. We've all heard the stories about people who were picked up by a tornado, transported a couple hundred yards, and set down unharmed. The trauma that would occur from the blast wind would all be secondary trauma. And in tornadoes, the way people get maimed is by being struck by other debris within the tornado. 2x4s, household appliances, stoves, refrigerators, cement blocks, and these are the injuries that result in body parts scattered over square miles.
All right. So, Tim, I want to get your opinion on some of the descriptions from the actual paper. So I'm going to read directly from the paper here for a moment. Quote, 2 human skulls were found about 20 centimeters apart, adjacent to a portion of pelvis and a likely arm bone fragment. One skull was missing the mandible, and the right orbit was crushed about 50%. The second skull fragment consisted only of the upper dentition and lower half of the right orbit. Only 2 or 3 rib fragments were found, and no other long bones were recovered. The forensic evidence suggests that the 2 bodies may have been decapitated, dismembered, or disarticulated. This was found in the upper tall portion of the site. So, Tim, in your experience as a medical professional, seeing many types of injuries over the years, would you say that these types of injuries are indicative of what you just described from the high winds and the blast wave?
Again, the amount of trauma described would be from the blast wind and material carried by it. Having walked over the so many times, I can tell you that it's full of rocks that vary in size anywhere from a pebble to fist size to hundreds of pounds. And we just heard about a massive rock that was turned over on its side. So there would have been a tremendous amount of debris carried by the wind that could easily account for the amount of trauma seen. The leg that you see, the lower leg with the tibia, fibula, and all the ankle bones and the foot, was almost certainly buried and escaped major trauma on that basis.
It also appears that there was, along with the human remains, or at least attached to the human remains, were some of the proxies that we talked about earlier, some melt glass and some other things that were actually fused to the bone.
That is fairly dramatic evidence, and that I think a lot of the narrative up to that point leads to those data. The SEM evidence where fragments of melt glass, quartz, and proxies for an impact were actually found embedded in bone. And I think that's the point that I think the major authors, I'm a very minor player in this, the major authors wanted to make with the data.
Now, let me add here two things. The first is that every sample of soil that I examined contained small bone fragments. I think it's fairly safe to say that anywhere you looked on that tell, you'd find bone fragments. Everywhere I've looked at the tell, I found bone fragments. They're very small. They're the order of millimeter or less. I mean, these are fragments that are just astonishing when you see there's just a little bit of bone. You think, what is that? And turns out to be a bone. Some of them had melt glass on them. So that gives you an idea that there was some serious and widespread, I think mutilation is safe to say, of the occupants of that city.
The other question, and this is kind of fun, the other question that I was asked was when the blast winds came through, they would be carrying a lot of sand and debris and dust, and would that not flay all of the flesh off the bones? And so I have a sandblaster, and I decided to test this theory with a chicken thigh bone with the skin on. And I turned my sandblaster on to this chicken thigh bone, and I could not get through the skin after concentrating the sandblaster on 1 2-centimeter area of the thigh bone. And so I do not think that these people were sandblasted and they had all of their flesh flayed off, and that's the reason we find bones in relatively pristine shape.
Now that is science at work, ladies and gentlemen, right there. Yeah. Creativity. You get points for creativity on that one. Yes.
Yeah. The whole time that we're talking about this and we're talking about the blast and all that, I keep in my mind, I'm seeing the old movies from the nuclear test that we did, in the desert Southwest, where they did the mock-up houses and the cars and all that. And there's some really great videos of that. And that's what I'm imagining. But, at the end of the paper, or towards the end, there's a discussion of possible mechanisms that could have produced the results that we see now in those excavations. So let's talk about that a little bit and what the conclusions were that could be drawn from that.
Well, I have to say that we all looked at those videos. I think every one of us at one point or other during this investigation brought up those videos and looked at them, because we kept on thinking in those terms. So it's not surprising at all that it occurs to you. I would say that it's probably worse than that. And the reason why I think it's worse than that is because this thing was moving, and it was moving fast. And the energy, certainly the airburst itself had an energy yield, if you will, that was similar to an atomic bomb. But then you've got the same effect magnified by this jet of plasma, if you will, from the airburst that still has momentum, even though it's effectively debris. It's coming down in melted form and hitting the Earth. And creating a secondary wave, if you will, of the debris that it has excavated from the surface sediments. And that becomes essentially the projectiles that become every bit as damaging as the heat and the wind and the rest of what we've talked about. and carries its own heat and envelops the city, if you will, if it's close enough. So I think that's what you were getting at.
You want to mention the velocities? Some of them?
Well, I mentioned supersonic already, and I would say near supersonic. I don't, once again, the model will produce a result, which we have no idea.
No, for meteorites. The fastest one I came across was 134 miles an hour. It was written for.
134 miles an hour is probably not the one.
I'm sorry. 134,000 miles an hour. Usual is 40 to 60,000. This one was a record breaker at 134. That is close.
Yeah, we used. I have to think in kilometers and meters. Being a physicist, so we used the lowest velocity impactor we could find.
Let's paint this picture for the listener now as we kind of tie this all together. We have processes that have created temperatures in this city that rose higher than those of volcanoes, warfare, normal city fires. We also have evidence that seems to be consistent with known impact sites like Tunguska, the Chicxulub crater that's been mentioned earlier, Chicxulub crater being the one which triggered, presumably, the dinosaur extinction, discovered by the noted Alvarez team, father and son. Based on the data that we have on hand, in other words, all elements seem to point to the idea of a cosmic impact. Now, the real question I think that we are left with is that if the abundance of evidence suggests that that's what happened at this site thousands of years ago, how likely is it that the same thing could happen again today? We need to look forward as well as look to the past, do we not? Because it seems that the threat potential here is ever present.
Thank you for bringing that up. Thank you very much, because to me, all the furor about what this thing, the significance of this event in the past and whether or not it was Sodom, to me is almost irrelevant to the significance that it has for us. This is something that happens on a fairly, if not a regular basis, on a fairly consistent basis. It's going to happen again. It's happened in the past multiple times. These small impacts happen far more frequently than the large dinosaur killer, the Cretaceous Paleogene event that 65 million years. So these are much more likely. And in the past, people have speculated about what would have happened had Tunguska, the Tunguska event occurred over Rome, London, Paris, New York. Well, here we have an actual instance when an event of that magnitude occurs over an urban center, and it wiped it out. It obliterated it, and it did serious damage to everything in the vicinity.
For people who say, well, you're involved in all this research, so what? So what? Well, one other thing is that major impacts produce instant climate change. And that's a big buzzword right now, and it's probably germane. Whether or not that's what happened to the Jordan Valley for 700 years after this event, where no one inhabited the Jordan Valley, at least on that side of the Jordan, whether that's the reason or not, it's worth thinking about. It's the only thing I know of that produces instant climate change, with all of the water vapor and debris that goes into the stratosphere.
To Tim's point, I think we didn't cover this, but the idea that the airburst or impact introduced high hypersalinity, but we certainly find extremely high elevated salinity in the destruction layer to degrees that, as Malcolm and Tim have discussed, that would probably have prevented agriculture until those the lands in the Jordan Valley had time to leach out over many hundreds of years. And so, as Tim was suggesting, these kinds of impacts have immediate effects that we certainly have seen in terms of destruction, but also have very long-term effects that we see in the archaeological record that we can at least surmise may have been related to this event.
take that to heart. We don't want people to be afraid, but there was an incident in Canada where a woman's house was actually struck by a meteorite. Did you guys see this? Fortunately, her dog had been barking. She wakes up, she gets up, goes out of the room, hears an explosion, goes back in. Only later, when she calls 911, does she find the meteorite fragment there on the pillow. And that's actually not the only one that has occurred. Maybe in the last 12 months, there was another one, I believe, in Indonesia like that. Now, those are very small fragments of meteorites. What we are talking about is, again, on par with Tunguska in 1908, in greater magnitude than Hiroshima. And if this were to happen today, and it could, again, fortunately, we have on our side, we have, these monitoring systems that allow us to know what kinds of space objects are up there, at least to a certain extent. But of course, just a few years ago, we had Chelyabinsk that slipped in the back door. It's not impossible for this kind of an event to occur and us not be aware of it. I am thankful for the science that gives us a degree of awareness, but if we really want to know how bad this could be and how dangerous the potential might be, we must look to the past. And again, this research that you three gentlemen and your co-authors have done is of grave importance. I hope people will certainly continue to follow this, and I hope that the three of you will keep us up to date as we move forward. And lastly, I want to thank the three of you for being here tonight and talking about this. Malcolm, I think you had a final point.
I do. The systems we have right now, which are designed to look for incoming, if you will, can detect objects at roughly 140 meters in diameter. If that object has that size, we can see it coming in general. These objects we've been discussing, the Tunguska, the Tall el Hammam event, are 50 meters in size. They're a third of what we can see.
Yeah.
About the width of a soccer field. So you can still see it has substantial volume and mass, but it's not detectable. And these are the ones that do this kind of damage. We need to do better.
Indeed, it is very important work that you three gentlemen and your colleagues with the Comet Research Group are doing. Thank you once again for joining us. Tim, thank you for being a part of this. Your first time, I'm sure we'll be seeing you again. And I hope all of you keep us up to date on your ongoing research and return here to the round table on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Thanks to the panel for another awesome interview, and what a fascinating subject, guys.
Oh, it certainly was. It's unusual for us to have 3 guests plus the 3 of us, so that was quite a conversation. Great time, real professionals, some researchers we certainly appreciate and have tremendous respect for. And, of course, Chris Moore always for having us there on site with him on many occasions at White Pond and other locations. It's always great to see those guys, whether it's through the camera lens or it's actually out there as we're shoveling dirt. So thanks again to the gentlemen for joining us and bringing this, again, very groundbreaking and also very recent research right here to the 7 Ages Audio Journal. We take great pride in bringing these kinds of developments in science, history, and anthropology right here to this conversation, where we love archaeology and, of course, everything about the ancient past. Something else we also love is after a show like this, our appetite and our thirst has been whetted somewhat, so we pony up over here at the bar in the Cross Time Pub. Gentlemen, will you please both join me for one more round?
I certainly will. I'm going to toast up a caribou slobber to you guys this weekend.
Sounds delicious. So yeah, let's have one. In fact, pour 2. I'm going to make Jason drink one of those also. On behalf of Jason Pentrail, James Waldo, and yours truly, I am Micah Hanks. We are the 7 Ages Research Associates, and we will reconvene here in the Cross Time Pub again for more conversations and explorations of the ancient past next time on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.